Wu Jin felt the world tilt. His daughter had never spoken of a child. Not a word about a rescue. Not a word about a promise. And certainly nothing about bad men. His heart thundered against his ribs as the girl stood up, her eyes wide and hauntingly familiar, the same defiant spark Jian had possessed. Then, she said the words that would dismantle the empire of a man who thought he had nothing left to lose. She wasn't just my teacher. She was my mommy. Wu Jin staggered back, the cold realization clawing at his throat. The accident that took his daughter was no longer a tragedy. It was a hit, and the truth buried in that grave was about to set the entire city on fire. Stay with me until the end, because what this little girl is carrying in her pocket will shatter everything this mafia boss thought he knew about his daughter's death and the monsters hiding in his own shadow. Before we dive into this journey of blood and redemption, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and let me know in the comments. What would you do if you discovered your child had a secret life? Now let's get started. The damp soul air felt like a shroud as Lim Wu Jin stood paralyzed. He had come to this secluded hillside to be alone with his ghosts. Yet here was a living, breathing piece of a puzzle he hadn't even known existed. The girl, Vicky, sat on her knees, her small frame swallowed by a gray hoodie that looked several sizes too large. It was a stark, somber contrast to the vibrant pink she had worn in his daughter's photos. As if the color had been drained from her world, the moment Jian's heart stopped beating. Wu Jin took a tentative step forward, his shadow falling over the small, tear-stained photograph she held. The couple in the picture smiled with a radiant warmth that felt alien in this place of cold stone. He recognized the man, a low-level clerk from a district office, but the woman was a stranger. Vicky, he said, the name feeling heavy and foreign on his tongue. He crouched down, his tailored black suit straining against his frame. He didn't point at the grave with the authority of a boss. He reached out with the hesitation of a man touching a fragile bird. My daughter, how did you find this place? The girl didn't flinch at the sight of the dark ink creeping up his neck or the hard set of his jaw. She looked at him with a weary wisdom that no 7-year-old should possess. The secret garden, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rustle of the pines. She told me if she ever went away to the long sleep, I should come here and wait for the man of iron. She said he would have a heart, even if he forgot where he hid it. A physical ache blossomed in Wu Jin's chest. The man of iron. That was what Jian used to call him when she was a toddler, before the distance of his profession had turned their relationship into one of silent nods and expensive gifts. She had been preparing this child for his arrival. She had been banking on a humanity he wasn't sure he still possessed. She was going to take me to the big house, Vicky continued, her fingers tracing the edge of the couple's photo. But then the loud noises happened on the road. The bad men followed us from the clinic. She told me to run into the woods and never look back. She said she'd find me. Her lower lip trembled, and a fresh tear tracked through the dirt on her cheek. She didn't find me, mister. I waited by the river for 3 days. Wu Jin's vision blurred. For 3 months, he had accepted the police report. A faulty brake line, a rain-slick turn, a tragic accident. But as he looked into Vicky's watery eyes, the narrative of his life shifted. His daughter hadn't been a victim of fate. She had been a soldier in a war he didn't know she was fighting. She had sacrificed herself to buy this little girl time. He reached out, his calloused hand hovering near her shoulder. For the first time in a decade, the dragon of the South felt small. He wasn't a boss here. He was a grandfather whose legacy was sitting in the mud, clutching a dead woman's promise. She sent me to find you, Vicky? He lied softly, the words tasting like ash and silver. And I'm not going to let anyone take you again. As he helped her stand, the wind shifted, bringing with it the faint, rhythmic crunch of gravel from the path below. Wu Jin's internal alarm, honed by years of survival, shrieked. He looked toward the cemetery gates. A lone black SUV was idling near the entrance, its windows tinted to a void-like black. The morning was over. The war had found him at his daughter's feet. Wu Jin didn't wait for the SUV to move. He swept Vicky into his arms, her light weight a jarring reminder of how little she had to ground her to this earth. He moved quickly behind the shadow of a neighboring mausoleum, his eyes scanning the perimeter as he felt the child's small hands knot into the fabric of his suit. Stay quiet, Vicky, he murmured, his voice dropping into the low, vibrationless tone he used when death was in the room. Tell me about the clinic. The place Jian took you from. Vicky tucked her head into the crook of his neck, her breath hitching. It was the white place, she whispered, her words muffled against his collar. Everything smelled like lemons and stinging air. There were other kids there, too. We weren't allowed to play. We just had to sit in the beds while the men in the blue masks looked at our eyes and took our blood. Wu Jin's jaw tightened until it ached. He knew of such places, dark corners of the underworld that even he refused to touch. They were factories of human spare parts, where the vulnerable were dismantled for the highest bidder. Jian came in the middle of the night, Vicky continued, her voice gaining a tiny spark of awe. She wasn't wearing her pretty dresses. She had on dark clothes like yours. She told the man at the desk she was there to audit the inventory. But when he turned his back, she put him to sleep. She grabbed my hand and told me we were playing a game called The Great Escape. Wu Jin could almost see it. His daughter, the girl he thought was busy with art galleries and charity galas, infiltrating a slaughterhouse with the calculated coolness he had spent years trying to keep her away from. She hadn't been ignoring his world. She had been weaponizing what she learned from it to destroy it from the inside. We ran to her car, and she told me she was taking me to the big house, Vicky said, a ghost of a smile haunting her lips. She said it had a garden with statues that looked like lions. She said I'd have a bed with silk sheets and a grandpa who was as grumpy as a bear but as strong as a mountain. She promised that once we got there, the men in the masks could never find me again. She said the man of iron would build a wall around me that no one could climb. The big house. She had been bringing the child to him, to his estate. Jian hadn't been running away from him. She had been running toward him, seeking the one thing his violent life was good for. Absolute, terrifying protection. She had been miles away from his gates when the accident happened. She had almost made it home. She gave me the pink clothes so I'd feel brave, Vicky whispered, looking down at her now grimy gray hoodie. But they got too dirty when I was hiding in the woods. I'm sorry, mister. I tried to stay clean for the big house. Wu Jin felt a drop of rain hit his hand, but the sky hadn't opened up yet. It was his own composure finally fracturing. He looked back at the black SUV. It began to crawl forward, circling the cemetery loop like a shark sensing blood in the water. They weren't there for a funeral. They were there to finish the job they started on the highway. Don't be sorry, Vicky, Wu Jin said, his voice turning into the very wall Jian had promised. The lions are waiting, and I'm going to make sure those men never see a clinic again. The black SUV drifted closer, its engine a low, predatory hum against the backdrop of the weeping willows. Wu Jin didn't move. He remained crouched in the shadow of the marble monument, his gaze fixed on the photograph Vicky still held with a white-knuckled grip. In the fading light of the cemetery, the faces of the smiling couple seemed to sharpen, pulling a jagged memory from the back of his mind. He reached out, his steady fingers brushing the edge of the paper. Let me see them, Vicky, he said softly. As he took the photo, the professional mask he had worn for 30 years nearly shattered. He recognized them now. These weren't just random victims of a scary clinic. They were Elias and Sarah Webster, the two investigative journalists whose disappearance 6 months ago had dominated the headlines before being buried by the city's state-controlled media. They hadn't just disappeared. They had been erased. Elias had been a forensic accountant, a man who followed the money through labyrinths no one else dared to enter. Sarah had been a field reporter with a reputation for finding the bodies people wanted to stay hidden. At the time, the rumor in the underworld was that they had stumbled onto a ledger, a list of names that connected the highest offices of the government to the organ-harvesting shadow syndicate. Wu Jin flipped the photo over. In the bottom corner, written in Jian's elegant, precise script, was a date and a series of coordinates. His heart hammered against his ribs. These coordinates didn't lead to a government building or a police station. They led to one of his own shipping warehouses on the coast, a place he had left dormant for years. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. The Websters hadn't been running from the syndicate alone. They had reached out to Jian because she was the only one with the resources to hide them. His daughter hadn't just been a witness. She had been their handler. She had used her father's own neglected infrastructure to create an underground railroad for the very people trying to take down the monsters. They went to the quiet place, Vicky whispered, watching his face. Jian said they had to stay there to write the big story that would save everyone. She told me I had to stay at the clinic for just one more week while she got the papers ready. But then, the men with the masks came for them first. Wu Jin's hand tightened on the photo, the paper crinkling under his thumb. If the Websters had been at his warehouse, and the syndicate had found them, it meant someone within his own organization had leaked the location. Jian hadn't been killed by a random drunk driver or even a rival gang. She had been betrayed by the very men Wu Jin called brothers. The couple in the photo weren't just whistleblowers. They were the reason his daughter was dead. And Vicky wasn't just an orphan. She was the living evidence of the truth the Websters had died to protect. They're not in the quiet place anymore, are they? Vicky asked, her voice small and trembling. Wu Jin looked at the black SUV, which had finally come to a halt. The doors began to creak open. He tucked the photo into his inner pocket, right against his heart, and looked the girl in the eyes. "No, Vicky," he said, his voice turning into cold, tempered steel. "They aren't. But their story isn't finished yet. And neither is mine." The heavy silence of the cemetery was shattered not by a sound, but by a flicker of light. As Wu Jin stepped onto the perimeter path, shielding Vicky with the breadth of his shoulders, a tiny, blood-red needle of light danced across the cobblestones before climbing upward. It moved with lethal intent, tracing a path over the girl's sneakers until it settled, a burning ruby, directly over the center of her gray hoodie. In the world of the dragon, time didn't move linearly. It moved in heartbeats. Wu Jin didn't think. He didn't calculate the odds. He moved with a speed that defied his age and the stiffness of his grief. His hand caught Vicky by the collar, hauling her small frame behind a thick, centuries-old oak tree just as a sharp crack echoed through the valley. The bark of the tree exploded inches from his head, shards of wood flying like shrapnel. "Stay down!" he hissed, pressing Vicky into the deep grooves of the trunk. Her eyes were wide, her mouth open in a silent scream, but she obeyed, curling into a ball as another round whistled through the leaves above. The sniper was positioned on the ridge to the east, high ground, professional, and equipped with a thermal scope. They weren't just here to intimidate. They were here to sanitize the site. Wu Jin reached into the small of his back, his fingers wrapping around the cold, textured grip of his custom semi-automatic. He had promised Jian he would put this life away, but the Shadow Syndicate had made the fatal mistake of bringing the war to the one place where he still felt. A second red dot appeared, sweeping across the grass, searching for the child. They wanted Vicky. She was the final thread connecting the Syndicate to the Webster massacre, and they were desperate to cut it. "Vicky, listen to me," Wu Jin said, his voice a calm, terrifying contrast to the gunfire. "I am going to count to 3. When I do, I want you to crawl toward that stone angel behind us. Do not look back. Do not stop. Do you understand?" The girl nodded, her knuckles white as she gripped her hoodie. 1, 2. On 3, Wu Jin leaned out from behind the tree, not to run, but to draw fire. He emptied 3 rapid shots toward the ridge, not to kill, but to force the sniper into cover. The red dot vanished as the shooter flinched. In that split second of darkness, Vicky scrambled across the wet grass, disappearing behind the marble wings of the Moretti-style angel. A second SUV roared up the path, tires screaming as it skidded to a halt. Men in tactical gear spilled out, their suppressed rifles raised. They moved with the coordination of a specialized unit, not common street thugs. These were the Shadow Syndicate's cleaners. Wu Jin stood his ground, his back against the oak, his eyes narrowed into slits. He felt the old heat rising in his blood, the rhythmic, icy pulse of a predator who had spent 30 years at the top of the food chain. They thought he was a grieving old man, weakened by loss. They didn't realize that by threatening the girl, they had given the dragon a reason to breathe fire again. "You took my daughter," he whispered to the approaching shadows, his finger tightening on the trigger. "You will not have the child." The first cleaner rounded the tree, and Wu Jin didn't hesitate. The cemetery, once a place of rest, was now a killing floor. The chaos of the cemetery was a fading echo in the rearview mirror as Wu Jin's black sedan tore through the outskirts of the city. Vicky sat in the passenger seat, her small body still trembling, her eyes fixed on the blurring trees. She clutched a tattered, stuffed rabbit to her chest, A toy so worn its fur had turned a dull, matted brown. Wu Jin drove with one hand on the wheel and the other resting near his weapon, his mind calculating every possible route to a safe house that hadn't been compromised. "They're still coming, aren't they?" Vicky asked, her voice small but steady, a haunting maturity returning to her tone. "Not today," Wu Jin replied, his gaze flickering to the shadows of the road. "But we need to know why they want you this badly. The photo isn't enough to make them risk a public execution." Vicky looked down at her rabbit, her small fingers searching the seam along the toy's spine. "Jian said this was my heart of courage. She told me that if the bad men ever caught up, I had to give this to the man of iron." With a practiced tug, she pulled at a loose thread near the rabbit's neck. The fabric parted, revealing not cotton stuffing, but a small, heavy object wrapped in velvet. She pulled it out and handed it to Wu Jin. It was a heavy brass key, engraved with a serial number and the crest of a private offshore bank located in the heart of Seoul's financial district. "She hid it there the night we left the clinic," Vicky whispered. "She said this key opens a door to a room where the truth lives. She told me the bad men are afraid of the truth because it's the only thing more powerful than their guns." Wu Jin took the key, the cold metal biting into his palm. This wasn't just a key to a safe deposit box. It was a key to the syndicate's throat. Jian had been more than a whistleblower. She had been a thief. She had stolen the one thing a shadow organization cannot survive losing: its ledger. "She told me what's inside," Vicky continued, her eyes reflecting the passing streetlights. "She said it's a list of names. Not just the men in masks but the men in suits. The ones who buy the things the clinic sells. She said that as long as I had the key, I was the most important person in the world, because I'm the only one who knows the password to the digital box inside." Wu Jin felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. His daughter had placed the weight of an entire criminal empire on the shoulders of a 7-year-old girl. She had trusted Vicky with the encryption key to a digital ledger that likely contained the names of ministers, CEOs, and perhaps even members of Wu Jin's own inner circle. The scary clinic wasn't just a local horror. It was a global boutique for the elite, and Vicky was the living biometric lock to the evidence that could burn it all down. "Do you remember the password, Vicky?" Wu Jin asked, his voice barely a whisper. Vicky nodded, her expression solemn. "It's the name of the flower Jian said you used to bring her mother every Sunday. She said you'd know it. She said it was the only thing you never forgot." Wu Jin's grip on the steering wheel tightened until his knuckles turned white. Camellias, the flower of unpretending excellence and deep longing. His daughter hadn't just left him a war. She had left him a map back to his own soul. The safe house was a cramped apartment buried in the neon-soaked labyrinth of Gangnam, filled with the hum of cooling fans and the rhythmic clicking of keys. Minho, Wu Jin's most trusted technical specialist, sat hunched over a bank of monitors, his face washed in the pale blue light of the decrypted ledger. Vicky slept fitfully on a nearby cot, still clutching the gutted remains of her stuffed rabbit, while Wu Jin stood by the window, watching the street through a gap in the blinds. "I've bypassed the primary encryption, boss," Minho whispered, his voice cracking with exhaustion. "The Camellia password worked, but there's a hidden partition, data that was flagged for deletion just minutes after the crash. I've spent the last 3 hours reconstructing the fragments." Wu Jin turned from the window, his shadow stretching long and jagged across the floor. "Show me." Minho hit a final key. A window flickered to life on the center screen, displaying a grainy, wide-angle view from a dash-mounted camera. It was the interior of Jian's car. The timestamp at the bottom read 3 months ago, the night of the accident. The audio was a mess of wind noise and the soft hum of the engine, but Jian's voice was clear. She was humming a soft melody, the same one Wu Jin remembered her singing as a child. In the passenger seat, a much smaller Vicky was visible, her head nodding against the window. Suddenly, a sharp, metallic clack echoed through the cabin, followed by the frantic, rhythmic chirping of an electronic override. The car's dashboard lit up like a Christmas tree. "What?" Jian muttered, her hands tightening on the wheel. She pumped the brakes, but the pedal sank uselessly to the floor. The camera caught her glancing at the rearview mirror. Behind them, a pair of high-intensity headlights surged forward, closing the gap with terrifying speed. "Vicky, wake up!" Jian screamed, her voice losing its calm. Hold on to the seat. Don't let go. On the monitor, a secondary data stream appeared, the car's internal diagnostics. Minho pointed to a red line that had flatlined. There it is. Remote interference. Someone hacked the electronic braking system via the car's wireless diagnostic port. They didn't just cut the brakes, boss. They locked the steering and floored the accelerator from a laptop in the chase vehicle. The video became a blur of motion as Jian fought a machine that had turned into a coffin. The car veered toward the edge of the rain-slicked mountain road. Just before the impact, Jian turned her head toward the camera. She wasn't looking at the road anymore. She was looking directly at the lens, her eyes wide with a message she knew her father would eventually find. "I love you, Appa," she mouthed, the words silent beneath the roar of the impending crash. "Finish it." The screen exploded into static as the car tumbled into the ravine. Wu Jin stared at the frozen image of the static, his hands trembling with a rage so profound it felt like a physical weight in the room. It hadn't been an accident. It hadn't even been a simple hit. It was an execution carried out with the very technology his own syndicate had helped fund. The Shadow Syndicate hadn't just taken his daughter. They had toyed with her in her final seconds. "Find the origin of that hack, Minho," Wu Jin said, his voice a low, guttural growl that made the technician flinch. "I want the name of the man who held the laptop. I want the man who gave the order. And I want them before the sun comes up." The dragon was no longer just protecting a child. He was hunting the men who had turned his daughter's final breath into a digital ghost. The blue light of the monitors had barely stopped flickering when Wu Jin's phone vibrated against the metal desk. The caller ID was blank, an encrypted ghost signal. He answered, his silence a heavy, expectant void. "The dragon's nest is smaller than it used to be." A distorted, metallic voice echoed through the line. There was a wet, choking sound in the background, followed by a grunt of pain that Wu Jin recognized instantly. It was Marco, his longest-serving lieutenant and the man who had overseen his daughter's security for a decade. "Your man is loyal, Wu Jin. It took 3 hours of persuasion before he finally admitted he didn't know where you were. But we know what you have." Wu Jin's eyes shifted to Vicky, who had been startled awake by the tension in the room. She sat on the edge of the cot, her small hands balled into the fabric of her gray hoodie. "If you've touched him," Wu Jin said, his voice a whisper of freezing wind, "there is no corner of this earth where I will not find you." "Empty threats from a man whose house is on fire," the voice laughed. "We don't want you, Moretti. We want the girl and the ledger. You have 2 hours. Pier 47. If we see a single one of your soldiers, we'll send Marco back to you in pieces. Come alone, or the child dies with the man." The line went dead. Wu Jin stared at the darkened screen, the rage from the video still boiling in his veins. But it was now joined by a cold, calculating clarity. Pier 47 was a private terminal, one he had hand-selected for his daughter's emergency use. Only 3 people in his entire organization knew its significance. Marco was one, and he was currently a prisoner. He turned to Minho. Who else had access to the pier's security codes? Minho's fingers flew across the keyboard, his face pale. "Just the inner circle, boss. You, Marco, and Chairman Park." The name landed like a lead weight. Park was more than a partner. He was the man who had sat at Wu Jin's wedding, the man who had held Jian when she was a baby. He was the uncle who had promised to protect the family legacy. The realization of the betrayal was a jagged blade turning in Wu Jin's chest. The Shadow Syndicate wasn't just a rival. It was a parasite that had grown within his own family, feeding on his daughter's life to protect its own corruption. "He sold her out," Wu Jin whispered, the truth settling with a sickening finality. Park had known about the whistleblowers at the warehouse because he was the one the Websters were investigating. The mole wasn't a low-level rat. It was the man sitting at the top of the hierarchy. Vicky stood up, walking toward him with the quiet grace of someone who had lived in the shadows of bad men for too long. She reached out and touched the brass key hanging from a chain around his neck. "Are we going to the quiet place now?" Wu Jin looked down at her, the daughter of the people his family had destroyed, and the granddaughter his own child had died to give him. He realized that the trade wasn't just about Marco. It was about ending the cycle of blood that had consumed Jian. "No, Vicky," he said, checking the magazine of his weapon. "We're going to the pier." But we aren't going there to trade. We're going there to settle the debt. The drive to the estate was a blur of rain and fury. Wu Jin knew Pier 47 was a trap, but the real hunt had already begun at his doorstep. As his sedan crested the final hill, the sight of his home made his blood run cold. The iron gates had been torn from their hinges, and smoke was already beginning to coil into the black sky from the upper floor. Chairman Park hadn't waited for the trade. He was burning the evidence and the witnesses to the ground. Wu Jin killed the headlights and veered the car into the dense thicket of camellias that lined the perimeter. "We have to move," he whispered, lifting Vicky from the seat. The girl didn't cry. She simply held onto his neck, her breathing shallow and fast. They entered through the service tunnels, the air heavy with the smell of gunpowder and expensive wood ash. The grand foyer, once a monument to Wu Jin's power, was now a killing field. He could hear the heavy, tactical boots of the syndicate cleaners moving through the gallery above, their flashlights cutting through the haze of the fire. "Vicky, look at me," Wu Jin said, pulling her into the shadows of the library. He moved a heavy, floor-to-ceiling bookshelf, revealing a narrow, velvet-lined crawlspace hidden behind the oak paneling. "Do you remember what Jian told you about the big house? About the secret places?" Vicky nodded, her eyes wide as she looked at the tiny compartment. She said it was the only place where the world couldn't find her when she was little. This was her kingdom, Wu Jin said, his voice thick with a grief he couldn't afford to let consume him. "She played hide-and-seek here for hours. I never found her once. I want you to go inside. No matter what you hear, the loud noises, the shouting, you do not come out until I call your name. Do you understand? Are you going to fight the bad men?" she whispered, clutching the brass key around her neck. "I'm going to end them," Wu Jin replied. He kissed her forehead, a rare, soft gesture that felt like a final goodbye to the man he used to be. He slid the panel shut, the click of the hidden latch sounding like a hammer cocking. He stood in the center of the library, the flickering orange light of the fire dancing off the tattoos on his neck. He was no longer a man defending a house. He was a monster protecting a sanctuary. Above him, the ceiling groaned as the cleaners kicked in the master bedroom doors. "I'm down here," Wu Jin roared, his voice echoing through the hollowed-out shell of his legacy. "Come and get the ledger." The response was immediate. A flashbang detonated in the hallway, filling the air with a blinding white light and a deafening ring. Wu Jin didn't flinch. He moved behind the heavy mahogany desk, his weapon raised. Two cleaners burst through the library doors, their rifles swept toward the sound of his voice. Wu Jin fired with a surgical precision that hadn't dulled with age. 2 shots, 2 rhythmic thuds as the men collapsed. He didn't stay in cover. He moved into the hallway, a shadow among shadows, his heart beating with the steady, icy pulse of the dragon. He could hear them regrouping, their radios crackling with panic. They had expected a cornered old man. They hadn't expected the dragon to breathe fire one last time. Every step he took toward the stairs was a step toward the men who had killed his daughter. Every bullet he fired was a debt repaid. The siege had begun, but Wu Jin knew the real battle wouldn't end until Chairman Park was staring down the barrel of his past. The fire consumed the estate with a hungry, cleansing roar, turning decades of ill-gotten luxury into a pillar of ash that climbed toward the stars. Wu Jin stood on the manicured lawn, the heat of the inferno stinging his face, but he didn't look back at the crumbling stone. In his hand, he held the thick, leather-bound ledgers of the Lim Syndicate, the records of every debt, every bribe, and every drop of blood he had ever spilled to build his kingdom. With a final, decisive motion, he tossed the books into the heart of the blaze. They flared bright blue, the ink of his past evaporating into the night air. Beside him, Marco leaned heavily on a crutch, his face battered but his eyes clear. They were the only 2 left. The family was gone, dissolved by the very greed that had birthed it. Chairman Park and the Shadow Syndicate had been dismantled not by an army, but by the weight of the truth Jian had hidden in a child's toy. "It's over, boss," Marco whispered, watching the roof of the great hall collapse. "The boss is dead, Marco," Wu Jin replied, his voice a low, steady rumble. "He died in that house with his secrets." He turned toward the small figure standing by the camellia bushes. Vicky was still wearing her gray hoodie, but the terror that had shadowed her eyes for months had finally begun to recede. She looked at the fire, then at the brass key she now wore openly over her chest. The bad men were gone. Their names handed over to the few honest investigators Minho had identified within the digital ledger. A week later, the air at the hillside cemetery was crisp and clear, smelling of pine needles and new beginnings. Wu Jin knelt in the grass, his black suit replaced by a simple dark coat, the tattoos on his neck partially hidden by a scarf. He wasn't pointing or shouting. He was simply placing a single white camellia on the marble base of Jian's headstone. Vicky stood beside him, her small hand resting naturally on his shoulder. She reached down and placed a new photograph next to the flower, a picture taken just 2 days ago. It showed her and Wu Jin sitting on a porch, the sun hitting his face in a way that made the hard lines of his jaw look almost soft. "We're going on a trip, Jian," Vicky whispered to the stone. "We're going to the place with the big mountains you told me about. The man of iron says he knows a secret trail where the flowers never stop blooming." Wu Jin felt a lump in his throat that no amount of whiskey could ever wash away. He looked at the girl, the living legacy of his daughter's courage, and realized that his life hadn't ended 3 months ago. It had simply been waiting for a reason to start over. He wasn't a dragon anymore. He wasn't a boss. He was a man who had been given a second chance to be the father he had failed to be for his own child. He stood up, his knees popping, and looked down at her. "Are you ready, Vicky?" She looked up at him, her eyes bright and filled with a trust he had spent a lifetime proving he didn't deserve. Yet here it was, a gift from the daughter he had lost. "I'm ready, Haraboji," she said, the word for grandfather, ringing through the quiet cemetery like a bell. Wu Jin took her hand, his large, calloused fingers wrapping protectively around her small ones. As they walked away from the grave and toward the car, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of camellias down the hill. For the first time in 30 years, Lim Wu Jin didn't look over his shoulder. He looked only forward, toward the child who had taught a man of iron how to finally bloom again. We have come to the end of this story. Do you think Lim Wu Jin was overprotective of the kid? What would you have added or taken out of this story? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and do not forget to like and subscribe to the Cinema Corner for more stories. Thanks for watching and see you in our next video.